All right, here we go. New topic. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of what's called reapportionment, redistricting, and then this topic of gerrymandering. So let's get to it. First of all, this is a little cartoon. This goes back to the founders. Voters should select their own elected representatives, representative democracy, a republic. And then today, and we'll show it to you later, but when they redistrict, they can actually kind of select their voters. Politicians can. And it's a little bit problematic. It's one of the flaws in the system. Okay. This is Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution. It says representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers. In other words, according to the number of people that live in that state, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and exclude Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons. There's that 3/5 compromise. This is no longer part of the Constitution. They've gotten rid of that. They've actually gotten rid of a number of these things because now it is all it's all people. It's not just free persons. It's not just those bound. It's not excluding Indians, and it's now includes all that. So what is this? Okay, this is reapportionment. So reapportionment is the idea that, as the size of the nation changes in terms of population, and as the size of each state changes within the total population, that certain states are going to get more or less representatives in the House of Representatives. The House is permanently set at 435 members. So there are 435 representatives in the House, and that's a permanent number. That number is not going to change. It'd have to change by law. There was a law passed 120 years ago or something. I think that late 1800s, early 1900s. I forget exactly. You can put a comment in the comment section if you find that exact answer, for a little extra credit, perhaps. But anyway, it's set at 435. So let's just say, the U.S. we've got like 340 million people in the United States. And so California is, let's fake some numbers here. California is 40 million people. Let's just say we had 400 million people in the United States. So California would be 10% of the population, which would mean we should get 43 or 44, in other words, 10% of the 435. Well, if they do a new census, let's say there's now 500 million people in California, in the United States. And even if we might still have 40 million people in California, but now we're 40 of 500, now we're like 8% of the population. So at 8%, we should get 8% of 435 to be the number of representatives in Congress. Does that make sense? So the proportion of what each state gets in terms of representatives is determined by the proportion of how large that state is compared to the whole, and where that, and then that fraction of the 435 members. So it's probably more complicated than I need to say it, but anyway, they rearrange it. They reapportion. So it's every 10 years. Every 10 years, there's what's called a census. We had a census in 2020. I have not seen the results of that census, but the results will be probably published. It's all a little delayed due to the whole COVID thing, but I'm sure they'll be published this spring or this summer. And that'll say, hey, we now have, instead of 330 million Americans, there are now 340, 335, 350, I don't know, whatever the number turns out to be. And then they'll count how many Californians. Well, California, we've basically been shrinking slightly. We've had a little net migration out slightly. And we'll probably basically stick right around 39, 40 million people. But what we're not going to most likely do is grow at the same rate that the nation grew. So if the nation grew, let's say by 10% over the last 10 years, let's say we were you know, 320, 10 years ago. Now we're 350. That's about a 10% growth. We're going to lose some reps. We're going to no longer have 53, not because the state shrunk, but because the state shrunk in comparison with what the whole United States did. All right, and that was maybe a little complicated, but the idea is that every 10 years there's a census. They count how many Americans are, or how many people live in each state. It's actually not even how many Americans, it's how many residents. That's what a census counts, how many residents, which means you don't have to be an American. You can just reside here. You could be an immigrant. You could be a temporary, worker. You don't have to be an American. It's how many residents. And so they do that count. And it's a big deal every year. And it's an important deal because tax dollars, government resources, federal government resources that go to each state matter. And it's a lot of those resources are based on what the census says that our state has. Okay. California, as we said, is the largest populated state by far, by far, by far. Look it up. Look how many people we've got. Who's next? It's going to be Texas and then Florida and I believe New York. But we've got close to 40 million. I think it's 39.2 or 39 point something like that. And they've got, like Texas, I think has like 27, 28. Now maybe they're going to hit 30. I don't know. They're probably growing. But we're really big. And then Wyoming is the smallest. They've got somewhere around 600,000 people. Okay, so a 40 million with us, that translated to 53 representatives. 600,000 with Wyoming, that translates to one. One's the least you can have. Every state has at least one rep in the House of Reps. Okay, so it's called reapportionment, which is of the 435 members, kind of distributing how many reps each state gets, how many representatives each state gets. Okay. The population per representative, you can see, has changed. You can see way back in the day, every representative, I believe this is like 30,000. Every representative served like 30,000 people. And then it grew by, Civil War time, every representative served, they represented about 120,000 people. And by World War II, they represented about 300,000 people. And by 2003, it was like 650. And I don't even have the latest graph. In 2020, we got a larger population by pretty good, by 20, 30 million people larger. So we're going to be serving like 800,000. I think the current number is somewhere around 800,000 people per representative. So every representative has a lot of people on their as part of their constituents are called constituents. That's the people in their home district. This is California, I believe, in the population. Oh, no, I'm going to skip that. Tell you what, I'm skipping it. All right. Here is the allocation. Let me move myself here. So after the 2010 census, you could see who lost and who gained. So California, we didn't gain any. We didn't lose any. We didn't gain any after 2010. So we still had 53 representatives. But you can see, so who's winning? Who's picking up seats? The dark blue here gained representatives, which means their population grew, right? So Florida got bigger, Texas got bigger, Georgia, South Carolina, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Washington, all those states gained representatives. Who lost? Where are people moving from? Well, the New York, whereas New York used to be our largest state, now it's fourth. Pennsylvania, you can kind of see the cold areas. Now, these guys didn't lose much because there's nothing to lose. Like when you only have one, you can't lose much. These areas, it's cold. There's snow. People want to not live in the snow constantly. So there's kind of a southern migration pattern in general. Okay. And of course, if you only have one, you can't go any less than one. So even if their populations shrank in comparison to the nation, they can't go any less. And that's where we've got. You can see Hawaii has 2, Alaska has 1. Okay, so we will get a new map after the 2020 census when they release that. I'm going to guess that we're going to lose a seat or 2. I'm going to guess that California goes like 51, just a guess. And I'm going to guess Texas picks up a couple and Florida picks up a couple. I'm going to guess in general this pattern continues, that they're going to lose a little bit, and these southern states are going to probably pick up people. Okay, so there you go. There's that. Okay, these are the 3 terms you need to know. Need to know reapportionment. I've already discussed. Redistricting and gerrymandering. These are kind of related. So redistricting happens after reapportionment, right? So if a state, and actually every 10 years they can redistrict anyway, they could draw new boundaries for the district. So for example, for California, for our district where we live, our district currently includes all of San Luis Obispo County, all of Santa Barbara County, and a portion of Ventura County, kind of that California coast. Okay. 10 years ago, it included Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, but half of San Luis Obispo County was represented by someone in actual Kern County in Bakersfield. So there was a big strip across the Central California that went through, Cuyama and there's the inland area of San Luis Obispo County. There's no one lives out there, basically. Hardly anybody lives out there. And then, but it picked up some areas of even Shell Beach and parts of San Luis Obispo. And it depended on where you live. So when we used to figure out who your representative was, some people in the room had, at the time, it was Lois Capps as a rep. And then others had Kevin McCarthy as a representative. Just depending on exactly where you lived on the street. Even somewhere were like one street away from each other, and they had different congressional reps because the boundaries were different. Well, in 2010, they redrew the boundaries. They redistrict, which they drew new boundaries, and that whole Kern County connection went away. So that everyone in San Luis Obispo County is now represented by the same person, and that is Salud Carbajal. Salud Carbajal. All right, and so they redistrict. So there's an opportunity to redraw the boundaries, redraw the district borders. And the state legislature, so the legislature, they determine how. The legislature themselves can do it. They can appoint like a bipartisan or nonpartisan commission to do it. There's many ways they can do it. But at the end of the day, it's the legislature's job is to make sure the boundaries get redrawn. And so when you have 53 districts, that's a lot of districts. That's a lot of ways they can tweak and manipulate districts. If you've only got 1 or 2 or 3 districts, there's not a lot you're doing. Well, if you have 1, there's nothing you're doing. So the larger the state, the more districts you have, the more opportunity there is to create some funky district borders. That leads us to gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is the idea that you redraw those boundaries with the sole purpose of benefiting your political party. So if the Republicans are in charge of, I'm going to go for North Carolina a second, of North Carolina's, state legislature, and their job is to redraw the borders. Well, they can redraw boundaries to benefit their party. By benefiting their party, what it means is they're more likely to get more Republicans elected out of their state based on the way they draw the borders by the boundaries. So we will give you some of those. Okay, this was originally created by a man named Elbridge Gerry. And a cartoonist called it gerrymandering because Elbridge Gerry figured out a way back in 1811 here to draw some borders in this is parts of Massachusetts, I believe. Salem, to benefit his political party. Okay, so we'll get to what that really means. See, here is the old California. So San Luis Obispo is right here. And you can see that the majority of the county was actually part of this county, this Bakersfield County, which is Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy, you might remember, is the current House Minority Leader. He's the most powerful Republican in the House. So This is his district, although they have redrawn it. But part of the district was the coast. So depending on where you lived in the Central Coast, the little pink strand here was the territory that was associated with Santa Barbara and Ventura County, and that was Lois Capps territory. Okay, so this is the 2010, prior to 2010 borders. I don't think I've got the new one up here, so I do not. All right, so just to remind you, they have the census, the population number change. There's more or less districts, or even the same, and they just decide, like, we had the same amount of districts, and the legislature still an opportunity to draw the borders, draw the new boundaries, and the party in charge, in charge of the legislature, can figure out how they want to draw the borders. Certain states have certain laws that might require other things, but once again, those laws can be changed. At the end of the day, it is the state legislatures that decide it, and thus they can distort the Democratic or Republican balance of power. So let's see what you've got here. So here we go. Here's another definition of gerrymandering. But look over here. So let's say we've got a state that has 50 precincts. Okay. And maybe every precinct has 10,000 people in it. And 60% of them are the yellow, represent yellow, say 10,000, yellow people, and 40% represent green. Okay, so ideally, if you're going to have 10 districts out of these precincts, you would have what? You'd have 4 districts. Wait, let me say it again. You're going to have, 5 districts. Well, if you have 5 districts out of this entire state, you're going to ideally want, 2/5 of those districts to be green and 3/5 to be yellow, because that's the breakdown of the state. 3/5 or 60% are yellow, 2/5 or 40% are green. So you would want 3 and 2, right? That would be kind of the fair way to represent all. However, if you draw the borders in a funky way, like down here, so we could take the proportion outcomes. So they could draw the borders like this. We get 3 borders that are all long, 5 borders are all these long poles, right? And you come up with 2 green districts and 3 yellow districts. And that would be proportionate to who lives here, right? Or you can draw them something like this. This is a yellow district with more yellow than green. And then this has more green than yellow. This is more yellow than green, more yellow than green, and more green than yellow. So you still get 3 yellow and 2 green. So both of these, in theory, are proportionate outcomes where everybody kind of wins, or get what you should get based on how many people of each type, of each political persuasion, are in there. But look at this: if the yellow was in charge of drawing the borders, they could draw it like this. They can go, hey, this is a district. This top's a district, and that one. Hey, we got 5 districts. Yay for us! But what comes out of it? 5 yellow districts and 0 green. So Congress, if they were all in Congress, it would look like, wow, this state is a true yellow district. Like everyone, all 5 of our representatives represent yellow and no green. And is that truly what the state is? No, right? Because 40% of the state is green, and yet they would have 0 representation in Congress. Let's flip it. Maybe green has control of the state legislature, and they're going to draw the borders. Well, look at this. They could draw this border here. Okay, who controls that? Oh, I see 6 green boxes, only 4 yellow. Green. Who controls this? Oh, look at this funky one. It's almost all yellow. Yellow wins that one. Same thing here. Yellow wins this one. But these in the middle, there's more green. So even though 60% of the state is yellow, you're going to wind up getting 3 green districts and 2 yellow. So the yellow districts, yellow is underrepresented. Green, even though they're only 40% of the state, they get 60% of the districts, of the representatives. So that would be a misrepresentation of who really lives in this state. And remember, the House of Reps is supposed to represent the House of the people. It's supposed to be a representative kind of sample of who lives in the states. So both of these would, fairly badly misrepresent what that state is like in terms of politics. And yet the legislature has an opportunity to do that. Okay, so there are some states that have been accused of doing this. So for example, 2018, North Carolina, this was their district races. There are 13 districts in North Carolina. And you can see some of them are kind of weird. Look at District 12. Long, skinny, weird district. Does that look natural? Does that look like a district that fits geographically? Now, I believe this follows a river, but nonetheless, it doesn't look right. Look at this purple one. Kind of funky. Even this blue one, where the purple dissects, cuts across. So if you live right here, you're in the blue number 2. And if you live over here in blue number 2, but as you drive across the way, you're driving through the purple number 4 district. Number 1 here is kind of funky. So you've got these weird drawn districts. And what's happened is, look at that. Out of North Carolina, 10 of the House seats of the House districts went to Republicans, and only 3 went to Democrats. So you would look at that and go, wow, 10-3. What a strong Republican state North Carolina is. But no, when you look at all the votes cast, it's basically a 50-50 state. 50% vote Republican, about 50% vote Democrat. And yet the way the borders were drawn up, the Republicans were able to gain control of the state in terms of demographics, in terms of political. Okay, so here's a sample we could, if we were in class, we could do this. A state has 100 voters, 52 are Democratic, 48 Republican, leaning. Okay, blue is Democrat. So you're supposed to draw it in 5. So you could see, you could draw all kinds of funky lines to get what you want. Now, what should happen out of 5 districts is you probably should get 3 districts that are Democrat and 2 that are Republican, even though it's a pretty close. But there's a little bit more Democrats, a little bit fewer Republicans, 52-48. Okay, and here's a way to draw it. This is what is called cracking. So there's different techniques, gerrymandering techniques. One is called cracking. So crack is when you'll see the blue here. Okay, they were able to crack their opponents, where they were able just to split enough. 13 blue, 13 blue, 13 12, 13 12, 13 12. They made it really close, but they split them enough to draw the borders where they were able to get all 5 seats. Okay, they cracked their opponents. This is a technique called packing. Packing. So packing is you kind of sacrifice an area. So in this case, the Republicans, the red, controlled it. So remember, even though it was 48-52, that there were fewer Republicans, what they do is they take this district here and they kind of sacrifice it. So they pack in a bunch of blue, a bunch of Democrats, get all packed into the same district, and then they're able to just narrowly win the other 4. So they get a 4-1 advantage. See that 13-12, just squeeze by. Why? Because they basically gave up on this. They said, "Hey, we're going to let blue dominate on this one, so that we've got a pretty good chance of narrowly winning the other 4." So out of the 5 districts, 4 of them become red. Only 1 becomes blue, even though there are more blue in this state. This is also something called stacking. So you stack 3 of the 5 solidly in your favor, and it's safe for both parties to create large majorities. So you can create these large majorities and make sure that you never lose. So this is actually turns out to be a 3-2 blue, but there's not a lot of competition here. See the problem? 15-10, 15-10, 10-15. So you've got it where it just stacked in one or the other party's favor. And so so if you're the Democrats, you're going to win these three. And you just know you're going to lose those. But at least we're always going to keep that district, that district, that district, because 15-10 is a really large lead, right? So you might just stack it so that you're kind of guaranteed to get what you want. Okay. Good deal. An example of a wasted vote or cracking style happened in Columbus. Okay. And what they did is Columbus, Ohio. They split into thirds, each segment attached to an outnumbered by larger conservatives. So whereas Columbus, Ohio is a pretty strong Democratic city, okay? But what they do is they crack it. So they instead of having where you make sure you get, that they're going to be represented, you can divide it up into these. So there's District 12, District 15, and you can make it so that even though this whole area is perhaps like right here, say Franklin County, right? Franklin County is a strong, like 90+% Democratic area. If you put them as just part of these other suburban areas that are strong Republican areas, then you minimize their impact and you can split them all up. You kind of crack them all in different places. And so they lose out. Okay. Here is a gerrymandering in Texas. Okay. So Austin, Texas is the capital. That's a pretty liberal area. When a lot of liberal Californians move to Texas, they try to go to Austin. It's the state capital. There's a university there. It's kind of a college town. And it's compared to the rest of Texas, pretty liberal and democratic. And so they took this area of Austin, and you can see it right here, and they cracked it. See, Austin's this whole thing, and yet it's part of 3 different districts. This one's this long, strange one all the way down to the Mexico border, and so they lose the ability to really have as much influence because of the way the districts are drawn. This is one in Pennsylvania, and you can once again see this really strange district of packing. So they packed in heavily Democratic areas in one district so that you could. It's like giving up on that district. Hey, let's put 95% of them in that district. That'll be an overwhelming win for Democrats. But then the rest of Democrats outside, we can splinter them off and kind of crack them. So often you're doing packing and cracking. You do both. If you're a good gerrymanderer, you're doing both. Okay, here's another strange one in Massachusetts. Here's Florida. You can see this district in Florida, all along Tampa Bay. And then like St. Petersburg here, which isn't even really connected by land, just connected by the bay. Maybe that makes sense, right? It's all bay-related living. Maybe people living here have more in common with people living here than they do people here on the peninsula or on the Gulf of Mexico side. But there's Florida. There's Pennsylvania again. I think we already saw that one. And this is one that's always seen as really strange up in Illinois and Chicago. And this is a district. Skinny little lines. That everything in that green is the same congressional district. And so that's once again, that's just bizarre, not natural by any stretch district. To give some other examples, so as a result of gerrymandering, Republicans in Pennsylvania that should say won 13 of the 18 Pennsylvania House of Representative seats, even though 83,000 more people in Pennsylvania voted Democrat. 83,000. 83,000 more people voted for Democrats in the House, in Congress for Pennsylvania, but 13 should be of the 18, well over half of the there's only 5 Democrat congressmen or women from Pennsylvania. So there's more than, I mean, that's like 70% of the Congress is Republican coming from Pennsylvania, even though there's more Democrats. So there's been some gerrymandering there. There's been some drawing of boundaries that benefit the Republicans. Why? Because the Republicans control the houses. By the way, there's also, within the state level, there's the state legislature where they draw the boundaries. So Republicans get a hold of the state legislature. They redraw the boundaries for their own state legislature seats, for their state assembly, their state senate seats, so that they can make sure they always win the state legislature. And then they redraw the boundaries for the national congressional seats. And so that's this way of maintaining power, even though they're not the majority, even though the majority of Pennsylvanians were Democrat. Remember, we just had the last election. Pennsylvania voted for Joe Biden it was close at one point, but by the end, it was, I think, over 100,000 people. And yet you might get 13 or 14, Republican seats out of those 18. Same thing in Ohio. Okay. You had not quite over half, but 48% of Pennsylvania voters voted for Democrats, which means that there's 18 seats. You should get, say, 8 or 9 districts that would be Democrat. Instead, they only got 5. Why? Well, the way some of these boundaries are drawn. It's also happens where some people live. Some areas are heavily concentrated with Democrats. Inner cities, large urban areas tend to be more minority and more Democratic. So they do live near each other. So it's not totally unheard of. But nonetheless, the way you can draw borders, you can really ensure that your party kind of wins. Here's North Carolina again. And this may get a little redundant here, but same deal, right? So of the 13 seats, you can see 13 red seats, which was Republican, only 3 Democrats. And yet when you look at the total vote, this is for 2018, you had 50% vote Republican, 48% vote Democrat, only 2% difference. It probably, if it were to be fair, you'd have 7 Republican representatives and 6 Democratic representatives. But no, it's 10 to 13. Instead of 1 more Republican, there are 7 more Republicans. Okay. Michigan has a similar story. 2.3 million people voted for Democrats in Michigan. 2.1 million voted for Republicans. And yet, the way the districts are drawn, you get 9 Republican representatives and only 5 Democratic representatives. So I'm hoping that you see that we're looking at, a problem with this democracy where we are supposed to be a representative democracy where Congress is representative of the citizens of the United States. And it's not always. Like, this goes back to 2016 and it flipped in 2018. But even in 2016, Republicans won 54% of the House seats, even though 1.1 million Americans voted for Democrats than Republicans. So even though there's over 1 million more Democratic votes towards the House of Representatives, and yet Democrats still only controlled 46% of the seats, and Republicans got 54%. Okay. And that is my last slide. I know that was a lot of the same thing. And so I hope that was interesting. I hope you recognize the problem with redistricting and gerrymandering. Some states don't do it. Some states have laws that put in a nonpartisan commission. Other states don't. Other states are open about it. They almost brag about it, that they could rewrite it. And their theory is hey, to the victor goes the spoils. We won the election. We're in control of the legislature. We can write it. We can draw the maps as we want. There are several Supreme Court cases over the last couple of years trying to fight gerrymandering, and the courts basically knocked it down. The courts basically didn't really stop it. It seems like it should be kind of unconstitutional, but there are problems with that as well. So that is what I have, folks. I know that was kind of long, but I hope you get it. You got to get it. Okay.